All right, it's 7 o'clock. It is time for Table 13. Welcome everybody who's here, and hello everybody in the classroom. I am a wooden leg, and I'm here to answer your questions about DMing and storytelling, and maybe even a little philosophy and literature thrown in there. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions on questions for next class, and a couple of people in the classroom. So we will work on that and go through them one by one here. So the goose asked, who is not in the classroom right now, but is a very active member of the Irrational Radio gaming community, should I run two separate campaigns within the same world? They wouldn't be following the same storyline, as the characters would be different, and my story usually revolves around the characters. This is a great question. I personally love the idea of running two campaigns within the same world, two or more campaigns in the same world. As long as you do it right and do it with a little bit of space in between the characters and the parties themselves. You want to, uh, have a world that's big enough that you can support multiple parties and multiple campaigns without the storylines becoming too entangled in that you wind up running one big session. That would be something that you might want to save up until the end, something that you plan ahead of time with both your groups, so that everybody can make it to the uh, session. Give me a second here. I'm going to turn up my mic. Is that better? This is a little bit of a test here, everybody. All right. So yes, like I was saying, um, you want to you want to have your world that's large enough to support multiple campaigns without them becoming intertwined and ending up with one large party. This is hard because you don't want this because it's hard enough getting a group of people together at a group of 5 or 6 together to meet once a week or every other week. It's even harder to get a group of 10 or 12 together. And those kind of sessions are very taxing on a DM. I ran a 12-hour session over the winter, and by the end of it, I didn't want to touch a dice for a little bit. I ended up doing it because it's kind of my job, but I didn't want to for a while. Um, you want a world that's big enough to support those, but you also want a world small enough to make it worthwhile in that they affect each other. Something that I've found, especially in fantasy campaigns, is that if you have multiple continents that are separated by the size of the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean in size, they're not going to have a lot to do with each other. And if they do, you might as well just put them on the same continent anyway. If you're going to shrink the ocean with portals or magic or vastly superior technology that the setting might not account for, then you might as well remove the ocean in its entirety. If you want to have two land masses that are separated by a large ocean of water or some kind of storm or some kind of other geologic feature, um, that's fine, but don't set campaigns on either side of those if you expect them to have anything to do with each other, unless it's going to be somewhere down the line. I am running 4 campaigns on a continent called Paralandia right now that is about the size of North America, the United States and Canada and Alaska and all that. And it's just big enough so that they can be separated and not have anything to do with each other in a day-to-day concept. But it's small enough so that news traveling along paths can reach role players of other parties. And just like role players, they're going to be the most interesting part of anywhere they're taking part in. So you might hear people from a different place. They did something amazing and slayed a dragon or went through a catacomb, and the party that's 6, 7 kingdoms south hears about that a few weeks later, and it adds to the variety and richness of your story without you having to put much more work in. If you're doing two separate campaigns on two separate worlds, you don't get that. You can't have them intertwine with each other. So as long as you find a good balance, I find that you can make it work. But it takes that steady hand in world building to make it worthwhile. Because otherwise, it's not worth it. And on the other side, it's much too complicated to get 12 people all together. So if you want to do it, you want to do it as like a newspaper. And what I mean by that is the campaign that is affecting the other one through a newspaper, like a headline. They read a headline that down the road so and so did such and such, and that's a much better way of affecting different characters than directly, different parties than directly, because directly is very difficult because then you get time and the silliness of that. If you have a party miss a session, then the other party is now going to be ahead of them in time, and that gets very complicated unless you have some fudging distance between them. So I think that I have answered that question pretty. Does anyone in the chat have any questions or comments or want me to expand on anything of that? All righty. I didn't hear anything. That doesn't mean that there wasn't a question. We can move on though. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. All right. So it's another question by the Goose. He asks, so when you send your characters on one of their character-driven quests, how do you get all the other characters involved and not I assume and not feel left out during the adventure? So this is a great question. It kind of harkens back to you want to use backstories, but you don't want to use one backstory with the exclusion of all the others. Something that I like doing to solve this problem that the Goose is bringing up here is to have it so that the party gets interested in some MacGuffin, something that shiny that takes their attention, and then you connect that goal that they have with a backstory or with multiple backstories within the party themselves. So rather than build a campaign around a backstory, build the backstory around the motivation, or build the quest backstory into the motivation the characters that already possess. So let's say that they hear that there is a mine that needs to be cleared out, and there's a very powerful item at the bottom of this mine. Um, and the person that clears it out gets to keep this item, or the party that gets cleared out gets to keep this item. So your role players decide that this is a worthwhile quest of their time, and they delve the mine. And in the backstory of one of the characters, let's say it's a dwarf, his great great grandfather was the king of a faraway dwarven land, but it fell to ruin, and his bloodline is now kind of bereft of all lordship, but he still can trace it back to his kin. Well, the magic item at the base of this mine is actually his great grandfather's warhammer. And none of the people that tried to get to it knew that. And he doesn't know it either until he comes upon the warhammer. And, you can do a Thor thing where he's the only one who is able to move it because he shares his grandfather's blood. This is a great way because if you like tried to lead the party by the nose and say that, oh, such and such or so and so's great great grandfather's warhammer is the base of this mine, you all should go get it. It's harder to get them involved organically because maybe they don't want to help the guy, or maybe they don't you don't want to feel like favoritism. You don't want to feel like, oh, they're just going to do this quest so that he can get the item. Rather, you want to leave a kind of bit of mystery there in that the item turned out to be part of the backstory rather than the backstory woven in for the entire time. This is very practical, and it helps to use character backstories without having to shoehorn it in, which is, I think, kind of Goose's fear here. Is it how can you involve other characters in other characters' backstories without feeling like you're doing favoritism or feeling like you're leaving them out? And the way it is just to hijack their motivation they already have. If you have a good group, you'll be able to find the motivation very easily and replace that or make the object of that motivation the backstory that you wish to flesh out of one of the characters. That would be a great way to do it organically. I've seen some really beautiful moments doing that before, um, by like switching things out. One of my I had a character who split off from the rest of the group to go find some really powerful item. And through her search, she found out that another one of the player's fathers had actually been in possession of this item. Well, as she was separated from the group, she didn't tell anybody, and so she wound up finding this guy's father, and he was lost. He didn't he thought his dad was dead, and it wound up being a really big long story about those three. Is this the two role players and this other role player's father that she found? And it turned into a really big thing, and that was because of the backstory that was woven into the motivation that was already there. I talk a lot about story skeletons, where you want a bunch of like story structures that you can add meat to or proper nouns to really fast and make them special with what you add. Like I use Romeo and Juliet all the time. Is that at the very base of it, it is a two lovers that love each other across lines that cannot be crossed. Um, and for Romeo and Juliet, it was their family lines. But for the story skeleton, it's really any lines. All it takes is two lovers that love each other across these forbidden zones. And voila, you can add, whoever the two lovers are. You can just keep that in the back of your head, and that's a full story. I mean, you can just do it like Romeo and Juliet. They love each other across foreign lines. They're in the middle of a suicide pact, and the role players stumble upon them. And you can make it just plug that into whatever your ad-libbing comes up with. So if you wind up with saying that a guy, like an innkeeper, has this love that's maybe in a rival guild hall or in a rival family, you could just kind of ride the Romeo and Juliet story skeleton while making it your own. And this it holds true for the character-driven quests as well. Um, Tie the characters into well-known plot structures and make the motivation that your characters have part of the story that you're trying to tell. So that was Goose. That was another Goose question. Does anyone in the peanut gallery want to say anything about my answer to this question? So Zikafor asks, what are some of my favorite story hooks? And the way I'm going to understand story hooks is the beginnings of stories and how to get your role players into the stories themselves. Um, if you want to clarify, Zeke, you can do it on the chat because the chat won't be streamed, just the questions channel. So if you want to clarify, I can see the chat without streaming it. But anyway, so some of my favorite story hooks are like relational story hooks, usually, which involve people being motivated by the relationships they have with other people or the relationships they have with themselves and their own drives. Some of my favorites are, the innkeeper that has uh, a strayward son or daughter. They've fallen off the tracks, and the innkeeper is just, beside themselves with, this young waif who's fallen on bad times and run in with the wrong people. I use that a lot to give the role players an in with the bandits or an evil force in the village or the city or the country they're in so that um, if you know something about a bandit or know something about the group and you come to them, from their parents rather than from the group, you have a different connection with them than if they were just another bandit. And so it gives the group some believability because, like, the bandits that you're killing aren't just nameless nobodies. They've got names, and I love hijacking like a relationship hook to introduce like the bandits or the bad guys or whatever, um, because it leads to a lot of different storylines. The one I did recently was the daughter of a farmer that they questioned knew the password to the bandits. The farmer knew the password because his daughter repeated it so often, and so he gave it to the role players, and so they had an in without having to even involve themselves directly with any direct members of the gang. Another one I really like doing is like the power motivation that people have, the power story hook, in that like so and so or such and such is trying to get to power, and they're using certain methods to go getting this power, and the role players are either fouling up a method or a key part in one of the methods. Um, if he's a good guy, sometimes the role players can be all for it. And if he's a bad guy, sometimes the role players will rejoice at their chance of fouling up the evil guy's plans, uh, as he's making them. Um, and some other ones are like the good man plot, the good man hook, like he's the best person in the society that he lives in, and he is doing all he can. He's like a messiah figure almost in the world that the role players are or the local community the role players are taking place in, and their interactions with him can lead to some pretty interesting stories as well. If you have an evil party, they can try to ruin his day, and if you have a good party, you can maybe he can become one of their most trusted allies. Um, so those are some, and there's tons of story hooks. Basically, in order to get a good library of them, just read, because every book, whether it's good or bad, has a story hook in the front of it to try to get you to keep reading. And recognizing what those hooks are and why some of them work on you and why some of them don't is a very powerful tool to use in role playing as well, because you can try a variety of hooks in session zero or session one, all at one time or in quick succession, and see which ones have the most effect on your role players, um, without forcing them or railroading them down any one line. Um, so yeah, yeah. Do you have any story hooks that you want me? Oh, we got chat. Oh, okay, yeah. So we can move on to two story skeletons, like story lines that you can follow. Um, so there is man, I'm gonna butcher this, but it's like you can look up archetypal symbolism, and Carl Jung wrote quite a good few papers on the idea that there is some symbols that are uh, that transcend human societies. Like every society has the symbol of a hero, for example. Every human society that's ever been has a figure in mythology that has done deeds, usually good deeds, that are far and beyond what a normal human can do. That's one of the most universal story skeletons is the hero's journey. Like, he starts from nothing and gets to somewhere. So a way you can involve your role players in the hero's journey without, it being their journey is have them meet a hero on a hero's journey at some point in his journey that, not at the very beginning. So, for an example, take the Karate Kid, the story of the Karate Kid. That's a hero's journey. He starts from nothing and he works his way up through hard work and pure of heartness to defeating the evil forces that he was set against in the beginning of the movie. You can have your role players meet the Karate Kid as he's going in to like fight Cobra Kai, and have them either help him or hinder him. And you can come up with some really interesting storylines by using your role players to foul up already existing storylines such as this. Another good universal symbol is the symbol of the father, which is like to say like a patriarchal authority figure. And especially in like 2019, you can take that in multiple directions. You can take the patriarchal authority figure and set them against the role players in that. it's a Beowulf situation, and he's like the strongest and the best in the land, but he's kind of a jerk on at the same time. And so they can deal with the complexities of a king that is just but kind of a jerk. Or you can do the evil form of the father figure, the overbearing noble who wants to marry his daughter into a horrible house to get him ill-gotten gains or whatnot. Um, these are that's another really good one. In fact, I recommend if anyone is interested in coming up with story skeletons that are really, really easy, look up the Carl Jung archetypes, the universal symbols, because each one of them has a story that goes along with it. Here, I'll look them up just on my own screen here so I can tell you about them. Hungarian archetypes. There we go. Yeah, there we go. There's a good Wikipedia page. I'll throw it up on resources. Um, I got the Wikipedia page here. So, okay, yeah, here we go. Archetype of figures: great mother, father, child, devil, god, wise old man, wise old woman, the trickster, the hero, the apocalypse, the deluge, and the creation. So each one of those is a story skeleton, has a story skeleton behind it that you can use on your role players in any point within that story's, maturation. You can have like Great Mother, which is like you can go crone, like the witch motif, and have them run into some witch that is doing something evil to a town, or you can go with the like kind matron motif and have them meet if anyone's read The Strand, the old woman in The Strand is a good example of this, where she's like the perfect mother. I already talked about the father, the child motifs. It's according to Wikipedia, one of the four survival archetypes. And you can any child story would have pretty big effects on certain parties as of role players. Um, for a variety of reasons. A lot of people put the line in the sand, between the good groups that are chaotic evil and the just the murder hobos is like their um, pretensions to kill children. I joined a campaign right after one of the characters had attempted to kill one of the role players had attempted to kill the child, and the lawful good, lawful neutral characters that were with him killed him. There was some PvP that was inherent there. But yeah, you go through these, you can find a whole bunch of them. I usually don't get quite that intense with the story skeletons. I don't have like Jungian archetypes bounce around in my head, but I do have, the really easy ones. And, any story that you enjoy, you can pull the story skeleton out of it and use. Oftentimes I find myself using a story skeleton that I, absorbed from an episode of Game of Thrones, or um, some YouTube video that I was watching about a video game. A character had some kind of revelation or made some kind of character choice, and I was like, oh, that's I'm gonna take that and use that in one of my campaigns. That character motivation or that character choice. Um, so those are I could talk forever about story lines and story skeletons and how I use them in the campaign. Just because I've done it a lot. And yeah, so focus me up here, I guess. Those are some of the ones I really like, but what should I talk about without rambling about just every story that I've ever heard? Because I would do that if not checked. So Zeke, is asking for some examples from past campaigns. So one of the ones I'm pretty proud of was the the farmer's daughter one, and I'll flesh that story out a little bit more. So the role players had been, it was session one. The role players had been tasked with simple guard duty of some farms that had been uh, subject to some bandit raids. So while protecting the farms, lo and behold, some bandits tried to raid them, and the role players duly set them to justice. On some of the bandits' bodies, there was a note that said, "Go to this town, in this inn, and say this password." And I think it was like the night bird flies at dusk or something like that. So they decided to go and check it out and learn more about this. So they went to the city, which is Tofast, I believe, the city of Tofast. And on the way there, they were stopped by a man who said that his daughter had taken very ill and was wondering if anyone in the party could help him. Well, one of the party members had a herbalism as one of their skills. He had a herbalism kit. So I had him roll, and he discovered that the daughter was ill because she had ingested some kind of local flower that was poisonous. So he whipped up they had to go find flowers, and they whipped up an antidote and saved the girl. In thanks, the father told them that his brother owned an inn in Tofast, and that if he just told him that you had saved his niece's life and that his brother had told them to give him give him whatever they wanted on the house, he would. Well, it turned out that this inn was the inn that the brother owned was actually the inn that was on the note. So they had a great lead. Not only were they on the way to the inn with free room and board, but they had a way to talk to the bartender. So I had this great story set up where I was going to have the guy, the uncle of the niece that they saved, have a daughter that ran on the wrong side of the law and wound up with these bandits that they were actually trying to find. Well, the next session, when they got to Tofast, they completely forgot about the little girl that they saved. They went to the inn, they talked to the bartender, but didn't tell him anything about the little girl, so they had to pay for their rooms. And then they went about talking to everybody but the bartender about this note that they had found and about this password. And so this farmer told them not to say that password because it was like bad news, and he took off and left. Well, the role players decided that they were going to follow him because that sounds suspicious. And so they were leaving the bar that I had lined up to give them all the information. So I quick up lifted up my skirts and scurried in a different direction and had it so that there was the farmer's daughter who was running on the wrong side of the law. And it was his daughter that was with the bandits that they were trying to find, the farmer. And so when they questioned him about it, that's how he knew the password. And that's how he knew that the password was because bad people did it. Because his daughter had wound up running in with these bandits. So I felt really happy about that one because I didn't have to waste the story skeleton that I came up with, which is man's daughter was wound up dating the bandit leader or ran on the wrong side of the tracks and just switched it over to another NPC. So I didn't have to be married to the NPC that I'd attached a storyline to. And you never have to be. Um, Another one was I had Zeekifers actually in this campaign, is I had a group that was framed for smuggling a dangerous substance across the city, and they did, but they were asked to do it so that they could get arrested. They were framed, double crossed, I suppose is a better term. And so I had a few plans for how that was going to go down, but I had a few role players who ended up not being able to make it to the session. And so um, I had to carry on and ended up just doing a law firm or a trial with the role players, with one of the role players unable to remember anything because he had amnesia because he wasn't there in the session. And it was really fun because it's not very often that a role player gets to use their knowledge history and their research skills to save the whole party, but the lawyer on the group did, and that was pretty cool. Um, one from a like a backstory that um, was in another campaign entirely was I had a role player who she also had to leave a lot while we were role playing through this campaign. So rather than have her disappear completely, I did a uh, the Lost Princess storyline or a story skeleton where she ended up being without her knowledge, like she didn't even have this in her backstory, but she ended up being the princess of one of the most technologically advanced civilizations. And so whenever she had to go, it was her father calling her back and teleporting her back into this society. And then we would role play a session or two outside of it, outside of the normal session until she could get back into the normal one. She'd get teleported back in once the session began, and she'd have a whole new backstory or a whole new or a whole session under her belt that the other role players didn't get to have anything to do with, and wound up having something really interesting to talk to rather than just disappearing. So there's a whole lot of different skeletons that I've used. Those are three examples from past campaigns. Um, so you got any other questions for me here? We got another half hour of this. Just for anybody listening, next week I am planning on going through and doing a map making seminar. I do draw hand-drawn continents and role-playing maps for patrons of Irrational Radio as well as for my own campaigns. And I am going to be going and drawing a little, 8 by 12 map on a sketch pad with the camera focused on that instead of my ugly mug. And we'll go through that for the hour. I will show you my process and how I turn paper into a landmass. All right. So how do you deal with role players who may not see eye to eye but want to continue the campaign? So this kind of gets into the interpersonal uh, problems of role playing in that you aren't playing with, you're playing with real people. It's different from a playwright or a director in that these people don't exactly have to listen to you for what to do. In fact, that's kind of not what role playing is. And it's not necessarily these people's job to listen to you or each other as well. They're not being paid. It's not the profession, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you, get people who want to sit down and play a game that may not see eye to eye to stay in the same room with each other? Well, it's a very good question, and it kind of comes down to, how do you get people who don't agree with each other or tend not to agree with each other to work together? That's like kind of the crux of the situation there. The first step, like I always say, is communicate, communicate, communicate. Try to get the role players to see eye to eye. Set them down. Try to get the grievances out in a controlled manner that you can, mediate as the DM, and try to get them to understand each other's point of view and try to get it so that they're friends. Because really, the best campaigns are played with friends, rather than I know in the online communities there's a lot of strangers where you're playing with strangers. You might be playing with people that you don't necessarily like very much, and it may be your only chance to DM. So how do we deal with people that kind of piss us off sometimes, or how do we deal with two people who seem to butt heads constantly? And the first step is communicate. Um, and the way that Daffodil here has phrased the question kind of also uh, begs me to say that they both want to stay in the campaign rather than one person being the trouble person, because it's your campaign, so you're free to kick people if they are threatening the fun of the other people. But if it is a problem that is something that you might be able to solve together as like a group, that would be the absolute winning condition there. And the best way is um, Really, like I said, communication, trying to get people to see eye to eye. Um, use there's a whole bunch of strategies, like interpersonal strategies, like use non-threatening language. Don't ask leading questions. Don't beg the question of the negative, try to get it so that it's as respectful and understanding as possible between all the parties. Um, and generally try to get people to understand this is a game. We want to have fun. And sometimes fun takes a little bit of work. Sometimes fun takes a little bit of takes a little bit of sacrifice on your part in terms of maybe working with people that we might not like a lot. But you can find fun in anything, and you can find goodness in anybody. And so as long as you're able to connect to the goodness of the group that you're in, or the person in the group that you're in, you'll be able to create an interesting story. But it really it also kind of goes into keeping the character and the role players separate. You can dislike someone's as a role player, but really like their character, and sometimes dislike their character but really like the role player. And these are um, two sides of the same coin, in that you want to remind them that those two things are separate. And if someone steals, like a character steals from another character, it's not the role player stealing from a role player. It's not your wallet; it's a bag of pretend gold. So you want to try to keep those things as separate as possible. Um, and if you're like an eye to eye in terms of like politics or religion or belief structure or anything like that, there's enough no room in the campaign for that kind of thing. If you have players that are like from two sides of a political aisle, or two opposing denominations or something, just kind of set down the line and say we're not going to discuss that. The first person to bring it up is going to get a warning, and the next person is going to get kicked out. Um, because this is a role-playing campaign. This is a fantasy land that has no bearing, or isn't supposed to have any bearing, on the real world and real world issues. So we want to try to keep those out of our campaigns as much as possible. Um, so yeah, I think I got that one down. If anyone wants me to expand on anything in that, feel free to throw it in the chat here. I'm going to go ahead and delete that question. All right, so Shady asks, what method do you use to keep all the info straight once you read a critical mass information and lore wise? Um, so I tend to really like to keep my information in separate Word documents, that kind of all integrate into one person. I've tried to one place. I've tried to find different sort kind of like wikis to use to organize it. But generally, I rely on either myself or mine remembering it, my role players, or the people that I have to help me keep my lore straight in some of the larger universes that I have. I rely on them to help me with names and things like that, because I'm horrible with even names that I've come up with myself. So it's kind of a organized mess. The one of the best methods I found for at least keeping notes, which allows you to build good lore, is take a sketchbook and just every session. Here, I'll show you like a page of one of my sessions. So like take a write down the name of the session, the date, and then just scribble. I just scribble, and I just write down important things. It's helpful if you were in college. Just keep notes like you kept notes in college. This is an important name. This is an important piece of information. Yada yada yada, but not too much. Um, and um, yeah, it's just kind of organized chaos. And that's kind of the best way I've found to start the making of lore. Um, I then go to making Word documents with titles that are proper nouns, like either this country or this person or this group of people. And then when I get to like a larger scope, I start keeping Word documents that have like that each name of in the Word document refers to another Word document with those that pieces of information. It kind of like builds on top of itself, but it gets really unwieldy really fast. So I am searching for a little bit better way of doing it. I've kind of dabbled in OneNote. I've dabbled in World Anvil. Um, and it just kind of comes down to I like a little bit of mixture of everything. I tend to adhere to structures that I create myself rather than um, organizational structures that are imposed upon my information. So like, that's why like OneNote is difficult for me because um, it's a structure that's imposed upon my information, and I feel almost stifled when trying to sort things into nice little organized like units rather than like the mess that I have on my sheet. I also tend to use maps to hold lore information a lot, in that I'll have like uh, a map that will detail a political sphere of influence and use that to remind myself what's going on within that world or within that country. Um, insight into the world building process. I always start with really big picture stuff. I tend to enjoy starting from like a position of like gods, um, where um, like creator gods or some kind of creation. I find that the creation myth, like however you set that down, is um, better than starting from like something else because I like building from way back forward. But you can do um, the I'm going to start an interesting scene or an interesting idea that I had and kind of build backwards and forwards from that. Um, because like it's in my mind, I guess like the very crux of the world building idea is that any idea or any scene or any character that you come up with in a vacuum, that isn't really necessarily related to anything you're working on per se, you can create an entire universe out of that. So one of my favorite examples is like there's a man in the red hat walking down the street. Well, if this universe is to be consistent, we have to have a history for every part of what we just said. We need a history of the street. Who built it? Who paved it? Where does it go? Where does it come from? What city is it in? Et cetera, et cetera. And then a history of a man. What's his mother and father's name? What are their parents' name? With one person, you end up with an incredible exponential growth of population. So from one person, you can infer an infinite number of people. Um, from a red cap, you can infer some kind of production. Either he made the red cap with the knowledge that he gained through his life, or he, built the red, or he bought it from a store, and then that infers a whole nother set of systems and situations. So and then you keep going, and so if you have some idea, like, oh, what about like like a lich who keeps himself alive through electricity? So it'd be like a Frankenstein mixed with an undead lich, where he like needs to feed off electricity to keep himself alive. Well, that infers a whole lot of things, both in the past, what led up to a lich that needs electricity to survive, and into the future of this universe. What eventually kills him? Everything must end. So what ends this lich? And every time you answer one of those questions, you create an exponential number of new questions. And by answering these new questions, eventually you'll have an entire universe. If you sat down for your entire life and wrote down exactly the manufacturing process of that red cap and where the fibers that made up the red cap came from, and what the name of the grandfather of the man who sewed the button on the top of the cap was, you will end up with a full universe. It has to be, because each thing infers a larger portion of the universe. So that's kind of the crux of my world building system, is that all you need is like that little inspiration, and you can turn it into something bigger than Harry Potter or bigger than Star Wars in scope. Um, So, it's it's a it kind of a messy world building, scheme. I also tend to start with a map. Um, an idea in a map pretty much is where I start. The lich that can feed off electricity, and then I draw the continent that they're on, and then I set down the cities, the paths, the countries, and then the history just gets fleshed out from there. And then the future is determined by the um, by like what the role players do. And that's one of my favorite parts about role playing in stories is that in like universes I make is that I get to like set a line where I'm like, and I don't know what happens after this. It's up to like these group of five people to determine the future. And I have like entire worlds that have been in decided large portions of their histories have been decided by long-term role-playing campaigns that resolved in ways that I couldn't have ever written as a single person. So yeah, that's a little bit of an insight. If you want any more specifics, just throw it up on the question board. I'm going to go ahead and delete Shady's questions here. Okay, and then Daffodil asks, how is the creative process different for the 12-hour campaign versus a normal weekly campaign? Um, so the 12-hour campaign was very special in terms that I didn't. I've never done something like that. I hadn't done something like that before, and I haven't done something like that since. So I made sure that I set it up in a way that was easy for me to work through for 12 hours. So the secret of the 12-hour campaign is that it must be have a goal that is easy to maintain but hard to reach. And the goal in the 12-hour campaign was literally make sure a stone doesn't move for 12 hours. And they did it. Stone didn't move for 12 hours, but it almost like literally killed some real people. And the creative process behind that was just basically the same kind of idea of writing a wild stallion. If you put role players, even the worst role player into a situation, they're gonna do some stuff, and it's gonna be some silly stuff, and the NPCs are gonna react interestingly to that silly stuff. And so you just kind of got to keep balancing you don't want the entire military showing up and shutting down the role players, but on the other hand, you want there to be some risk. You don't want the role players to spend 12 hours sitting in the middle of a grassy field where nothing happened. You want there to be something to bubble up from the basement, so to speak. And but you at the same time you got to keep it balanced and you got to keep people's moods up because 12 hours is a long time versus a normal weekly session. Man, I don't have to hardly work for normal weekly sessions for the most part because I try to cultivate groups that do 80% of the role playing campaign in role playing in that, and it's usually not with me. So I'm just kind of sitting here listening to people make pretend voices and talk about what the next town is going to hold while they walk down a path. Um, and that requires very little work. I tend to do a lot more world building for normal campaigns, is how I kind of set up for sessions. Um, and it just kind of um, make sure you've got like something going on in each town. Like, you have someone is always trying to do something everywhere you go. It doesn't matter if it's good or evil or, mundane or exciting. Someone has to be doing something so that role players can react to it. But in that 12-hour campaign, I don't have to do that because there was 16 people role playing in a city square. So they were like shouting loud music and partying and carrying on and killing guards, and it was a mess. It was a messy business. So I didn't have to necessarily like character plan very much or didn't world build a whole lot. It was just basically a referee for a bunch of role playing characters. So yeah, that's a that question. All right, we got 8 minutes left in class. Deleting Daffodil here. And feel free to, by the way, also, class will be ending at 8, but go ahead and post as many questions as you want to for next class. I will be recording that stream as well and answering all of those questions. that you post. I'll be deleting the ones that I've answered already. So, all right. So Goose asked, some different techniques that you currently use to improve your improv. Currently trying to come up with things on the fly when I run games, but it can be challenging. Um, so some different techniques that I currently use to improve my improv are I make names beforehand. My role players can tell when I'm like scraping the bottom of the bucket for names that I've used all the ones in the list that I prepared, because I come up with things like stuffy of swords and stuff, um, which is pretty bottom of the bucket if I do say so myself. But sometimes um, those kind of NPCs can be the best. You've all seen the meme where it's like, your role players walk in and the DM goes, there's a man at the bar. His arm is made of steel and he has three orbs of burning fire around him and his eyes glow with a green gleam. And they go, who else is in the bar? And role player, the DM's like, there's a goblin. What's the goblin's name? Sam Snorkel? I want to go talk to Sam Snorkel. I've had many campaigns derailed in that sort of way. So I always try to come up with names, but not characters. That way I can have interesting people that are like, kind of, just story skeletons, like I say, that aren't connected, or like character skeletons, I guess, in a morbid way, that aren't connected to a name. That way I can be like, okay, he's a badass assassin with a dead son and, a drinking problem. And he can be any one of these names that I've written down that I'm going to use this session. And I'm going to pick one as they meet him and ask him his name. But if they never meet his name, I don't have to use any of these. But it helps me, be creative with names without, basically pausing the session, going, hang on, let me look at a bunch of books on my shelf and come up with a name off the top of my head. And on the other side, it keeps your names from sounding super silly sometimes. Other improv techniques that I do are, or things that I'm doing to improve my improv is one of the things about improv that's important is you want tools and like in your toolbox. Like you want to have like that voice that you can use, or that that voice you've been practicing for a week, or that character idea that you got and been like working on. Don't immediately connect them with what the role players are doing, and instead try to find some time in the session to put that idea there. Connect it to the things. So all you're doing is you're not even, improving that much meat. You have two sections of things, and you're looking for a way to improv them together, to segue them together. And that helps with like, the sticky business of improv, where sometimes you come up with a bunch of stuff on the fly, but it means nothing in relation to each other. So rather than like really plan out how things are connected, plan out the big things and then come up with the connections as the role players move through the world. This saves a lot on like having to redo stuff too, because you also hear the trope of the DM burning his notes. Well, in this way, you don't ever have to do that, because you just have to, you know, keep that big secret organization in your pocket until they come to that big, deep, dark door that they've just discovered that you came up with off the top of your head. And you're like, oh, this would work perfectly with that organization that I had 2 sessions ago planned out that they didn't actually, get to. So it's a good way to prepare yourself to do the art of improv without kind of improving at the same with improving at the same time, I guess you could say. Because it makes it a little bit easier when you don't have to come up with the actual nouns and the actual story, but rather how the story relates to the story your role players are telling or running through. Um, and then, you got the other improv groups, things. Another one of my favorites is like the relationship game. Have someone name two things that they think are incredibly unrelated, and then you try to connect them in the least amount of steps. Then you can like ban certain things, like you can't use is part of universe, is also part of universe, therefore connected. You want to put down some rules, but that's fun. Um, Anything that requires you to relate to things that are not usually related together, on the fly is good improv practice. Because that is kind of the heart of improv. It's not making up the stuff. It is relating things that already exist together in a way that's new and interesting. And the best way to make stuff that's new and interesting is to come up with it on the fly and to connect to it on the fly. You know, that's how you come up with the non-tropey stuff. The real tropes kind of come out when you sit down and you think about stuff for too long. I've noticed a lot of times when my oldest projects tend to be the ones that are the most filled with certain kind of tropes. But because of the way that we want to relate tropes and relate those things that already exist together, they're sometimes the most interesting part of those old worlds because they're tropes done in a certain way that invokes a feeling of unease or, uncanny valley in the trope. Like it's like a Romeo and Juliet story, but Romeo and Juliet are like insects, and the sex scene in Act 3 is really uncomfortable. Um, so yeah. All right. Well, it's about 8 o'clock, so I will delete Goose's questions here and save these other questions for next week. Again, I am a wooden leg, and this has been Table 13, the story and role-playing DMing class, whatever it is. And thank you. If you would like to ask me questions or join up in on the classroom chat, join Irrational Radio, the Discord server. There's a link somewhere. I don't know. It exists on the internet, but we'll make sure we get that to you. All right. Thank you guys very much for taking part and watching, and I will see you next week.